Welcome to this summer series of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, you'll hear from 4 presenters at our 2024 conference. The first is Anne Henderson, who delivered a paper on the Menzies government, BA Santa Maria and the beginning of state aid. The second paper is from Professor Jennifer Clark on science and science education. The third paper is by Dr. James Waghorne and Associate Professor Gwilym Croucher on University Unlimited, Commonwealth Scholarships in Australian Universities, 1951 to 74. The fourth and final paper is from Dr. Lyndon McGarity on Menzies and a liberal education.
Thank you all. Before I start, congratulations, Georgina and Jack. To do these 4 conferences has been quite an achievement because I've watched it from the beginning to the end. And I hope this is just the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. All right, I'm here to blow a few myths apart. Okay, you send your children off to the internet and they're looking up state aid. It's a particularly Australian term. If you check it out online, it relates to Commonwealth funding of non-government schools in federated Australia, beginning around the early 1960s. And as a cause, however, it went back decades, right back to when the colonies decided that financed education in the colonies would be free, secular and compulsory. Only those schools would receive government funding. Some opponents of state aid, federal government state aid, believed it was unconstitutional. You'll also find in that online search that most of the schools that were independent were Catholic, and they were made possible by the salary-free system of religious orders. And I look back and think, how did they do it? Who worked for no salaries? They were also reliant on local parishes and the shillings and pence of Catholic families who were not very well off. And those schools were designed to teach religion as well as the main academic criteria. No, they're the basic facts, no problem here. But you read a little further online and your grandchildren, children, whatever, are going to get a huge myth about state aid. Most accounts will tell you that the beginning of state aid came after the Goulburn Catholic primary school strike of July 1962. Well, I'm here today to sink that myth, even as the legacy of the strike continues to mask the reality. As they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And the image of more than 2,000 Catholic children in a regional town being told overnight to move to the public school system, with their Catholic schools suddenly shut, swamping and drowning the local public schools, is an image that has retained its effectiveness. For all that, the Goulburn school strike achieved nothing more than its powerful image. Am I being heard? Okay. After a week, the schools reopened. The Labor state government continued to resist helping non-government schools in New South Wales, and the Catholic hierarchy in the Diocese of Canberra-Goulburn eventually paid the bill for the government-imposed renovation of the boys' toilet block at Our Lady of Mercy Preparatory School in Goulburn. No money from the government. Agitation for state aid for non-government schools really was around the work of Melbourne's Catholic Archbishop Daniel Mannix and organisations such as the Catholic Federation and the breakaway Democratic Labor Party of the early 1950s. But the real beginning of state aid, made directly by the federal government to non-government schools, came with Robert Menzies' speech while opening the Liberal Party's election campaign on the 12th of November 1963. It came at the very end of his summary of the Federal Party's provisions for education. Menzies announced that his government, no warning, if re-elected, would make available £5 million per annum to the provision of building and equipment facilities for science teaching in all secondary schools, government and independent. It was mind-blowing. It was an unexpected move. It was one that outfooted his Labor opponents and certainly helped contribute to the comfortable win for the Liberal Country Party coalition at the 1963 election. By 1963, the campaign for state aid for non-government schools had been going on for decades. For all that, it had fallen on deaf ears. State and federal, for various reasons. Sectarianism was one, in the form of a Protestant Catholic divide. It had always haunted colonial settlement, carried over from Britain. It also increased monumentally after the First World War, after the conscription debates and plebiscites, and a claim that many Irish Catholics were disloyal and were not supporting the empire. Thank you. The debate split Labor at that time and exacerbated anti-Catholic feeling. Independent or non-government schools had few, if any, friends in government. Within the Labor Party, strident voices of the hard left had no time for religious education being funded by government. The mantra of free, compulsory, secular continued to prevail. On the non-Labor side, politics was dominated by an Anglo-Protestant ascendancy, with little interest in bending to the pleas of what they regarded as their opponents, Catholics, who mostly voted Labor. Well-off independent schools of the non-Catholic variety were more than able to fund their own institutions without government aid. However, it's worth noting that Robert Menzies valued the existence of what he called church schools and previewed their challenges in the post-war world. In one of his Forgotten People radio broadcasts of 1943, he said, "It is unlikely that the church schools can, in the post-war period, efficiently survive unless there is some measure of state assistance to them. If these schools are not maintained by great church communities, the public as a whole will have to provide for them. Far more money for state schools and state instructions. It is unfortunate on a matter so important to go off into a merely sectarian dispute because religious background for education is so important." Now, while Menzies had seen something of the future, his belief remained that state governments were responsible for school funding. It was an economic matter. Why ask the federal government? It's a state responsibility. The future he did not foresee were the post-war developments, such as the split in the Labor Party of 1955, which saw many of the moderate Labor members expelled, and therefore those who would have supported state aid. And where the federal Labor executive had moved towards some sympathy for state aid in 54, after the 55 split, Labor was dominated by the left and state aid was strongly opposed. Sorry, it's my throat. Then there was the influx of post-war immigrants. So many of them are Catholic background from Europe. Their children filled Catholic schools in the 1950s, classes of 80, and put huge pressure on Catholic institutions with the added expenditure needed, alongside declining numbers in religious orders. Now, it's true with the Goulburn Catholic school strike in July 62, discussions between the New South Wales Catholic hierarchy and the New South Wales state government of Labor, Premier Bob Heffron, did begin consideration of funding science blocks for New South Wales independent schools. However, the move was quickly stopped by the Labor federal executive, and the Canberra schools strike had very quickly reached a dead end. Now, at the 1961 federal election, as you all know, the Menzies government came within one seat of losing government. Jim Killen, scraping home in his Queensland seat of Moreton, gave the Menzies government its narrow victory. And there's a myth there too, it wasn't with Communist Party preferences. He was saved by the preferences from the DLP, which in Queensland was called the Queensland Labor Party. The election result was then a warning to Menzies that Labor's new party leader, Arthur Calwell, had given Labor a fresh start. But the battle for state aid was only beginning. In a series of reports carried by News Weekly, the newspaper published by Santa Maria's National Civic Council, opponents of state aid showed no sign of giving up, while anti-Catholic sentiment in Protestant ranks shored up opposition in non-Labor ranks. Just after New Year 63, News Weekly outed the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, Dr. Goff, as an important opponent of government funding for independent schools. Likewise, the Reverend Bernard Judd, Secretary of the Council of Churches in New South Wales, had opined that any moves within the New South Wales Liberal Party to help independent schools would, quote, certainly alienate a good deal of Protestant support. That's my husband's phone, by the way. He obviously wants to be part of the deal. Former Prime Minister John Howard was a leader in the New South Wales Young Liberals around this time and recalls being part of a small minority within the New South Wales Liberals, along with John Carrick, Fred Osborne and Bob Cotton, who tried to push the practical notion that state aid would be a powerful weapon in bringing many Catholic voters across to the Liberals. But after the New South Wales Young Liberals passed a motion supporting state aid, the Liberal leader, Robert Askin, rang Howard and threatened to close down the New South Wales Young Liberals. That was the feeling. Okay, so Howard also believed, notwithstanding that John Carrick, who was then General Secretary of the New South Wales Division, was an important influence on Menzies in changing his view that state aid should only be a state matter. In June 1963, while in London, Labor leader Arthur Calwell set the cat among the pigeons in a newspaper interview where he claimed that state aid to independent schools was unconstitutional and that state aid would not be an issue in the next federal election. How wrong he was. Menzies hit back, criticising Calwell for his comments, and in August, B.A. Santamaria attacked Calwell, claiming Labor wanted to end independent schools. Weeks later, Calwell was protesting he'd been made a scapegoat, but state aid had become a sleeper in the political landscape. So enter the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, Dr. Daniel Mannix, and B.A. Santamaria. As recorded in his memoir Against the Tide, after the coalition had won so narrowly at the 1961 election, Santamaria had gone to Archbishop Mannix in early 1962, suggesting the time was positive for him to approach the federal government on the matter of state aid. The Archbishop accepted that the time was ripe, but it would be better for Santamaria to speak with then Federal Treasurer Harold Holt, which he did. This is what Santamaria said about it. The argument I put to Mr. Holt was simple. In 1961, the DLP preferences had gone solidly against the ALP, despite the force of the economic recession. Without DLP preferences, the government would certainly have been defeated. I strongly suggested that the government should offer some breakthrough in the matter of education allowances and that it should accompany this proposal with improvements in child endowment. Santamaria continued his discussions with Holt into 1963. He also argued that such a move by the Menzies government would expose the failure, re-state aid, of the right-wing New South Wales Labor executive and government. It worked. On his last visit to Dr. Mannix in November 1963, Santamaria reported to the AG cleric that his fight for state aid was about to see an important win. Holt had asked Santamaria to pass on to the Archbishop the news that Robert Menzies would announce grants for science blocks to all schools, public and independent, in his opening address for the coming federal election. So Holt had tipped off Santamaria. Must have been important. Now, Mannix would die before that speech was given. But the fact that Santamaria had been privy to such confidential information from Treasurer Holt ahead of the address indicates his important role in what Menzies chose to do. In the federal election of 1963, the coalition picked up 7 seats from the ALP in New South Wales, thus vindicating John Howard and John Carrick. As Santamaria described the move by Menzies, only a politician with his acumen could have done it. He later wrote, "Of the Liberals, only Menzies, with his intellectual subtlety and developed pragmatism, was likely to fully understand the nature of the opportunity thus offered. It is now a matter of state aid history that the Liberals used Menzies' policy speech on the 12th of November to make concessions on state aid that amounted to a breakthrough." And the rest is history. Thank you.
So in November 1963, Robert Menzies was vying for another term in government. He wanted greater political security and an end to what he described as having precariously and unexpectedly survived by one vote for 2 years. His election speech contained all of the expected statements on foreign policy, defence and the economy, immigration, health and housing. Buried in the middle was education. He began by listing his government's credentials in directly improving tertiary education and supporting secondary education through grants to the states. Then he declared his intention to promise something new. He recognised the need to improve science teaching if Australia was to keep up with the march of science. He proposed directly funding the building of science laboratories in school to the value of £5 million per annum. Then came the bombshell. That money would be allocated without discrimination. The decision to fund science facilities directly was connected to the recognition of the importance of science education in a post-Sputnik world, the growing public engagement with science, the example of the Industrial Fund's building program, the pervasive Catholic lobby, and the politically volatile issue of what was called state aid. All of these matters converged in November 1963 when the Australian people were called to the polls. Historians have taken a rather narrow view of the 1963 election and the non-discriminatory approach to science education. They have largely seen the issue through the lens of federal government intervention in secondary school funding, especially non-government schools. Marsh called the shift a major transformation, led by Menzies. The decision is invariably referred to as astute, suggesting Menzies recognised the importance of the Catholic vote, which favoured state aid. And we've heard a terrific case for that argument a moment ago. Moreover, he capitalised on the State Labor Party in New South Wales and the federal executive being conflicted over the issue. Perhaps the idea of the significance of the apparently opportunistic timing of the policy shift was only enhanced by opposition leader Arthur Call's condemnation of Menzies' decision as conceived in chicanery, born in duplicity, and nurtured in deceit. Hogan's interpretation aligned with Caldwell's. He described the grants proposed in the 1963 policy statement as best understood as electoral bribes. Tomlinson described Menzies' decision as pragmatic when electoral pressure demonstrated the efficacy of change, resulting in a reversal of policy his government had advocated for 14 years. Connell also prioritised the idea of state aid as the driver of the policy change. He acknowledged the importance of science as secondary and contextual, arguing that when he, Menzies, thought seriously about extending the federal government's financial aid to schools, he should turn to the support of scientific and technical education. More recently, Wilkinson et al. Argued that the science laboratory cause was a kind of lever that made the reintroduction of state aid a little less controversial. Smart said science aid was a shrewd political choice. Most recently, Campbell and Proctor referred to the anti-communist Catholic vote as available for possible seduction. In each case, historians interested in the new policy direction of 1963 focused on science education as an excuse to implement state aid as the primary vote-catching issue. If the 1963 election shift was all about catching the Catholic vote, it is not clear whether this actually had any impact on the outcome of the election. Hogan argues that state aid cannot be given credit for Menzies' 22-seat majority. Instead, he names foreign policy, defence, and the Labor Party's position on American bases. I've argued elsewhere that the assassination of John F. Kennedy only 8 days before the election was also a contributing factor to the Australian people voting for security under the American alliance. Paul Hasluck reported to the Liberal Party that he believed Kennedy's assassination pushed the electorate back towards the government, and public opinion polling supports this view. As well, Menzies gave a telecast in Sydney on the day of the assassination that specifically referenced Kennedy's work in the sphere of Australian defence against the Chinese. By focusing on state aid when trying to understand the political environment of the 1963 election, we miss the significance of science and science education in particular, and at the same time, we skew our approach to the election and its outcome as well. What such a focus has done, however, is to underscore the importance of education to the social and political world of post-war Australia. Put in perspective, Gough Whitlam wrote in his memoir, "The most intense political debate in Australia during the 1960s was not about Vietnam, it was about education." With the exception of the establishment of the Canberra University College in 1929 and a block grant to university research in 1936, the federal government largely remained aloof from supporting education until 1950, when the Menzies government began an inquiry under R.C. Mills into the funding of universities, which led to the passage of support bills in 5 separate years. More importantly, in 1956, Menzies commissioned Sir Keith Murray, former chair of the UK University Grants Committee, to review the state of the universities. Although Menzies wrote that he wanted to bring international authority to the exercise, Martin credits the vice-chancellors who advised him to have an international approach. Still, it is fair to say that Menzies believed in the university as an institution, prompting him to act and later to reflect that I had a strong feeling that the Commonwealth must be the saviour of the universities. Tabled in September 1957, the Murray Report identified the need for more science graduates as a prerequisite to national growth and defence, arguing that no nation today dares, on grounds of national defence alone, to fall entirely behind or to be without its own good number of highly qualified men of science, of the academic or university type. And yet such an ideal could not be achieved without considerable cost and effort. The Murray Report noted a weak focus on science compared to other countries, inadequate equipment in universities, some dating back to World War I, and a poor pipeline of students coming through from the schools. If children at school were not encouraged in science, they either failed to pursue a university course at all, and if they did, they were inadequately prepared and either did not continue past first year or failed altogether. Murray warned that not addressing the situation may well prejudice the future development of the country. Only 1 month after the Murray Report was tabled, the world was transfixed by a small, shiny bauble, a little over 1 metre wide, weighing in at 84 kilos and emitting a detectable bleep. "Listen now for the sound that forevermore separates the old from the new," declared an announcer on NBC radio. Sputnik was the epitome epitome of Soviet scientific achievement. It's all that talk about religion. Sputnik was the epitome of Soviet scientific achievement. Its trajectory over the United States was calculated for maximum one-upmanship. The American press went into overdrive and reported on Sputnik-induced panic. Sputnik drew attention to the noticeable differences between the Soviet focus on science, the investment in science education to support it, and the way in which Sputnik heralded the potential for the Soviet military to use space as a battlefield. Devine argued that Sputnik signalled the weakness of American science, the failure of American schools, and the complacency of American political leadership. That did not end until the scientific revenge of the moon landing in 1969. Physicist George Henry Stein was more succinct. He said, "Unless the US catches up fast, we're dead." Although Eisenhower remained sanguine, he was concerned enough to immediately appoint MIT President James Killian as his new science advisor and drafted the National Defence Education Act, which specifically focused on new federal funding of education, supporting students to stay on at school and especially encouraging their study of science and technology. Because the response to Sputnik was linked to the apparent failures of the education system, the moment acted to galvanise education critics and reformists. As Barbara Barksdale-Klaus explained, once the Sputnik panic became an educational crisis, it coalesced with the long and hitherto inauspicious struggle for federal aid to education. It was not that it produced initial interest in such bills, but that it disarmed opposition to federal aid. Now, the spectre of Sputnik and the American story was not lost on the Australian public. The Australian Women's Weekly called Sputnik a new moon. In November 1957, the Australian Parliament discussed Sputnik's implications for national security. The member for New England, David Drummond, asked Menzies specifically if he was aware of Eisenhower's response and the link he drew to university and school science education. Menzies replied that he was working on it, he was looking at the universities already, and that's where he would focus his attention. In this respect, he was supported by Labor's Kim Beazley, who applauded the fact that Murray's inquiry into the universities was initiated in 1956, well before Sputnik induced any sort of panic response. Menzies' most reflective comments on the Sputnik episode and its significance for Australian science, education and national defence came in the third Henry Simpson Newland oration in March 1958, entitled Modern Science and Civilisation. And this was a theme that Menzies would return to several times in the coming years. He rationalised the need to encourage the pursuit of science without losing sight of the values of an education in the humanities. Menzies was supported by Kim Beazley again, who wrote that many tyrannical regimes have fostered science, but no tyrannical regimes have fostered those faculties of the university that deal with human affairs, sociology, and those fields of thought where criticism of tyranny is likely to emerge. Regardless of Menzies' restrained embrace of science, the Sputnik era generally excited the public as a gateway to the future. There was an inquisitiveness about science and a broad marvelling at its potential. At the opening of a new science building at Scotch College in 1962, Len Robson, who was the former principal of Shaw in Sydney, captured this sense of wonder. He said, "Surely, if there ever was a time for enterprise and boldness, for venturesomeness, and for the exercise of imagination in the making of schools, this is the time." Now, Menzies' idea of a civilised nation rested on the bed of humanities. It was long, dearly held and deeply personal. He told a school audience when opening a science block, "I associate myself a great deal with the humanities." Moreover, he had little personal inclination for science and admitted to a paucity of experience with it. He said, "I was the kind of fellow who gets through examinations rather easily, you see, except in science and mathematics." As a result, his own background and education to emphasise even more his conversion to the view that science was the subject for the new age, for the improvements medicine and biology brought to human life, and the way discoveries in physics would bring economic and political advantage. And he made this connection explicit 7 months before the election speech that translated these beliefs into policy. He said, "I am utterly convinced that we must pay an increasing attention to scientific training, to scientific discovery, to scientific application, if we are to be well in the march of time." By 1963, the popularisation of science had increased dramatically, aided by the Sputnik media storm and the efforts of dynamic individuals who wanted to address the paucity of science education in Australia, particularly Professor Harry Messel, the University of Sydney. He introduced a number of science schools, firstly for teachers and then for students. And they began in 1960 to draw a television audience of some 100,000 viewers. The Australian Women's Weekly called this one of the most exciting developments in Australian TV, while underscoring common attitudes to women and their ability in science. The Women's Weekly said, "The lectures given by some of the foremost scientists of the world have been adapted so that the most traditionally bird-brained woman could understand and enjoy them." Significantly, scholarships to attend Messel's summer science schools were equally available for boys and girls. They were described as being without discrimination. Messel was unequivocal. "It's not a question of whether a girl wants to know something about science. She must know something about it if she is to be a first-class citizen." So Menzies was directly lobbied, most significantly by the founders of the Industrial Fund, led by Len Robson from Shaw and F.E. Trigg, who was chairman of CSR. Now, Robson and Trigg were aware of a British scheme to build science laboratories, and they thought this was a good idea. And when they heard Menzies give a speech about him wanting to pour money into universities, they began to think that this was not going to be a sensible idea unless something was done about science education in schools. They thought it would be a wasted investment. And so they successfully built science laboratories for what they called independent boys' schools of standing. Now, these were 61 schools that came out of the Headmasters' Conference. By June 1964, 30 projects were completed. By 1967, the work of the fund had paid up over $1 million to build science laboratories in 37 schools. The school selection process was rigorous. The school needed to be able to put in at least 20% of the costs. They had to have high academic standards, good governance, and the students had to demonstrate an interest in science. Most notably, no girls' schools received funding under this scheme, although Harry Messel claimed that it was the girls' schools that were in greatest need. Trigg said that the girls' schools would have been considered if the money had reached that far, but it never did. But in reality, we know that science was a male domain, a view supported by Carver, the executive officer of the fund. So here we come to Menzies and the 1964 Act coming out of the 1963 election. Menzies acknowledged the work of the Industrial Fund and he approved of it. Similarly, the executives of the fund believed that their work was Menzies' inspiration for the shape of his new policy. He was often called upon to open the science blocks that the fund built, and he was intimately acquainted with the program its costs and how it worked. And he was also practiced in justifying the building of laboratories. He said, you can't teach science in the modern world unless you can also put into the hands of the student the things they are needed to illustrate to him, to give him the feel of the developments that have occurred in physics and chemistry and in a score of other subsequent and perhaps more refined studies. Whereas Menzies was unmoved by those lobbyists who advocated for federal involvement in education as a general principle, such as the Australian Education Council, the Parent-Teacher Education Council, the Australian Council for School Organisations and the Premier's Conference, he was deeply impressed by the Industrial Fund. And the link between the operations of the fund and the policy change of 1963 are indisputable. Menzies did not go to the election advocating federal funding of school education, but rather federal support for science education through Clause 96 that allowed for special grants to the states. And when Menzies went to the election in November 1963, there was no implementation plan for his new policy, which might suggest that he capitalised on Labor's prevarication to support science laboratories and fill the void. After the election, he called in John Gorton and made him Minister for Works, assisting the Prime Minister. His job was to implement the States Grants Act of 1964. And under Prime Minister Harold Holt, Gorton became the first federal minister for education and science in 1966. Gorton called the science block scheme a watershed in Australian politics. He and Menzies were both aware of rumblings within the community around sectarianism, but Menzies made it very clear that he abhorred sectarianism and would not countenance division over the science funding. In his memoir, Menzies described sectarianism as something that nauseated him, even as a youth and as a member of Parliament who needed to represent all of his constituents. Gorton was also unequivocal that the scheme was never intended to please the DLP. However, Menzies did address the sectarian debate in 1964 at the Cardinals' dinner. He denied he was cultivating Catholic votes and argued strongly that his support of science laboratories was because it was a sensible idea. The policy was introduced, he said, because Australia needed scientists. They needed to be better trained, and students need to be better prepared when entering university. He was quite blunt when he painted the scenario of being criticised for not distinguishing between government and non-government schools. And quite frankly, he said, whether it is through stupidity or otherwise, I just don't understand how any such distinction can be made. He made sectarianism out to be absurd in the case of supporting a purpose of high national significance. Moreover, he said, the Commonwealth Government coming in to give some special assistance for a special purpose has no right to discriminate. Menzies went even further and struck a personal note saying, if I had to do that, I wouldn't want to be in public life. To conclude, there is no doubt that Australian science and science education was inadequately serviced during the 1950s and 1960s. When Menzies proposed to contribute $5 million each year to improving science provision, he was responding to demonstrable need, highlighted but not introduced by the Sputnik propaganda value in 1957. As well, the efforts of the Industrial Fund proved that science laboratories in schools were necessary to deliver the new curriculum, and the fund provided a method, plans and demand. The significant thing about the 1964 Act that Menzies introduced is that for the first time, support for science teaching was offered to all children, regardless of the school they went to, whether it was government or private, irrespective of the religion of their parents. And what is often lost in the historiographical arguments around state aid, Menzies' scheme did not differentiate between the science education of boys and girls. The term without discrimination meant that all children were offered the chance to experience learning in the age of science. As Menzies told the audience at Geelong College on opening their new science building in 1964, one is so to improve the scientific equipment in the secondary schools as to give every boy or girl who has a scientific bent an opportunity to be much better trained, much further forward, much more accustomed to handling of new techniques and new equipment than ever before. And I am sure that this is going to pay enormous dividends in the development of the universities, in the development of science, and therefore in the development of Australia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zach, for that welcome, and thank you all for coming along today and listening to us. So yes, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet today. We're presenting a paper, it's a double act, so we're going to have to be disciplined. I'm talking mostly to myself when I say that, about keeping to time. So we're drawing on an oral history project that we've established, funded, as Zach has indicated, by the Robert Menzies Institute, assisted by our research assistant, Noah Mackillop, as well. And we've interviewed to date 15 recipients of Commonwealth scholarships, of some 31 that we have approached. We ask these people about their experiences of coming to university, their living and family circumstances, a whole lot of really impertinent questions. But we place the Commonwealth Scholarship at the front, and we're really grateful to all of our interviewees who are very generous with their time and very considered in their comments. So our aim was to try and recover the influence of the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme, which we think has receded into the background of the story of Australian higher education and of Australia more generally. We wanted to conduct an oral history interview as well, because one of the things that really interests me is the student experience. It's something today that's very relevant to universities, but finding that historically is very difficult sometimes. So the Commonwealth, as it was known, was a feature of the period of sustained economic prosperity and full employment, known as the Long Boom. And its function was to meet an acute and long-standing skills shortage in many areas, and Jennifer's just indicated science is one of those, but especially in the professional or managerial level. It became a signature higher education policy over 23 years, in part because Menzies was Prime Minister for so long, but also because his government built upon it and extended it. So our oral histories have revealed the tensions between policy and practice as students navigated a complex bureaucratic system of financial support. A series of individual decisions made to meet diverse circumstances became settled patterns in the expansion of Australian higher education, forged by public subsidy for individual students. So through our talk today, we're going to feature extracts from many of these interviews. But first, a brief overview of the Commonwealth so we're all across exactly how that works. So it was a scheme established in 1951 and continued until 1973. It continued and built on a World War II Commonwealth financial assistance scheme that had been created during the war, to provide support for students in reserved courses. And that had been continued for 5 years after the peace. So the Commonwealth was offered preferentially to all qualifying matriculants on the basis of their results. So it's a merit-based scheme. It covered tuition fees and all other compulsory charges, such as student union and sports fees. And it also offered a means-tested living allowance at differential rates for scholars who lived away from the family home. So the scholarships could be applied. Once you won a scholarship, you could apply that to any university course, unlike the Commonwealth Financial Assistance Scheme during the Second World War, and indeed unlike the Commonwealth Reconstruction training scheme, which was a post-war Australian GI Bill, another Commonwealth support for higher education, the Commonwealth Scholarship covered the full duration of a person's degree and had no service prerogative. The scheme was directed at school leavers. So initially those under 20 years, with a small number dedicated for mature-aged applicants over 25. And from 1962, scholarships were also offered to students in the later years of their degrees as proven candidates, if you like. So the scheme was introduced with 3,000 scholarships, and we have a nifty graph there. A number increase, and the first year you see a larger number because it was applied to people who would have been eligible who had already begun their degree in the first year. So it began with 3,000, and then after 1961 especially, it ratcheted up such that by 1973, 13,200 scholarships were awarded. And across this period, the scheme supported between a third and a fifth of all university students. One of the things we're interested in this is that it's a very general scheme, but we think it also diverted students, changed their approach. And that's one of the themes of all of our interviews. So we've guided these into some themes. And the first one is finding pathways. So a living allowance, as I mentioned before, was available, but only at a very low rate, roughly half the basic wage throughout this period. And this reduced sharply when a means test was applied to what was then known as the aggregate family income, including earnings from the students themselves. Managing this was a consideration for all our interviewees, even if for some it was a much smaller issue. For others, it determined how they completed their education, whether they would need to live at home or whether they could go further afield for study. And we've got an extract here from a University of Melbourne Faculty of Law handbook from 1960, showing the kind of individual decision people would need to take and how the means-tested living allowance, which was already, as I say, half the basic wage, reduced further very quickly on just a very moderate income. All the people we interviewed took some form of work while they were studying. Mostly that was vacation work, but others also worked on weekends or at the residential college in which they resided. So we find that students have to find solutions to meet their own circumstances. And this shaped all manner of things. So students had to become strategic in choosing their subjects in the end of their second year, their secondary education. We have an example here of a student, an arts student at the University of Tasmania, who it became common to do a second year of matriculation, so a finishing year of high school, partly to do with maturity, but also, as we found, to do with winning the scholarship. So this student stacked all of their better subjects in the first year, hoping to win the scholarship, and then they would go on to do some of the subjects they were weaker in, hoping then to take their scholarship and do a medical degree. Circumstances intervened, as it did with so many others, meaning the student undertook an arts degree. Often students had to manage a combination of arrangements alongside their Commonwealth scholarship, and because this combination was specific to them, they had to work it out by themselves. And so here's an example of a student attending ANU who's applying for a national undergrad scholarship. The really important thing about this quote, though, is the last line: "I was pursuing this by myself." It's a personal decision. Your own circumstances vary so much that you have to fit within the scheme and the supports that are provided. The requirements of applying for scholarships and applying for various combinations of support also meant that people had to nominate in advance what they planned to do. And students could then find themselves constrained. So we have another student at ANU who undertook a BA because that's what they wrote down on their initial scholarship application. They were trapped in that field, and in fact, this was fine for them. But it shows how the process of having to apply for various forms of support directs you into your degree. This is a very long quote. The scholarship was applied for first degrees only, except that it could be extended into professional postgraduate diplomas, notably something like a Diploma of Education. It also meant that changing degrees could be a fraught process and potentially costly for the individual if it meant a cessation of the Commonwealth. Now, here's an example of a student who became interested in microbiology and decided, well, maybe I could apply to change into medicine. But to do so, they would have to go back a year. I mean, it gets very complex and arcane, you can see. They'd have to go back a year, and in that year, they would lose their scholarship for the year, which was a great risk. And this person weighed the failure rate and the prospects and so forth. And in the end, they decided that they couldn't do it. So we see this generous scheme also really shaping the way people approached their education. And I'll hand over to Gwilym to take off the other half of our session.
Thanks very much, James. So, as we've alluded to, the oral histories have really recounted how the Commonwealth was the first time that there was a nationwide scheme that provided a pathway through university for students from families with modest means that relied solely on their academic performance. As James has spoken about in the last few minutes, students were often had to be quite strategic, and some of the features of the scheme, which we'll turn to now, both guided their pathways. But when we're starting to think about the legacy of the scheme, we're starting to think about the impact of the scheme, we'll turn now to think about some of the opportunities and obligations that the scheme placed upon students and how it enabled them in many ways. So it offered more than opportunities for career and employment for many students that came from modest means. It also offered the intangible status signifiers that university provided. And we've put up a quote here from a student, that's our interviewee, that recounted to us that they had come from a family of modest means. And I think it's the last line that we wanted to really pick up on, which is where they say, I thought, well, why not? Why not me? And that is part of the important contribution that the Commonwealth made, which is what we'll turn to now, is in changing notions of student support, what it would mean, what it could mean, and indeed what came later. And we'll turn to that in a moment. But first, the Commonwealth was both open to men and women without consideration. And this was significant, as such an approach to gender equality was not provided in many other areas. We've talked about this earlier today. So, for example, in the Australian public service, women were routinely let go after marriage. And we've just put up a quote here that we thought really encapsulated this. It was something that was picked up by a number of our interviewees that this was not something that the restrictions they did not feel at university, and was certainly something, a benefit of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth also gave students space and confidence to focus on their study. So, for example, we show here the case of a student who attained a Commonwealth only after their third year, having taken a loan for their first 2 years. And this is really critical because, as this quote says, and it's there in the last line, they wouldn't have done a PhD and got into a research career if they hadn't got the Commonwealth Scholarship. It really was one of the first schemes that enabled people, because of the fact that it didn't have the reserve courses, the CFAS previous scheme, and it allowed people to follow their interests in a way that other schemes had not. For some, the funds that the scholarship provided were just spending money. For others, they were much more significant and created opportunities that were not there. And we have this wonderful quote from one of our interviewees about a multicoloured pair of beachcomber shoes and that they were repaired by a friend of theirs, you'll see up there, and that, you know, people made do. But really critical, so we've talked a bit about opportunities and obligations, really critical for us to consider when assessing and thinking about the Commonwealth is the questions of prestige and privilege that it brought. The Commonwealth had a definite prestige associated with the award that many interviewees identified as something they were conscious of both during their studies and subsequently. It marked out recipients as students who were most able to benefit from university. And I think it's really critical, most able to benefit. Clearly, recipients' prospects were not determined exclusively by the scholarship, rather it gave them scope to succeed. And we have a wonderful quote here that encapsulates that and says, in my first year, there's a status hierarchy where the Commonwealth Scholarship was on top. Many other support schemes, such as the studentships, teachers' studentships and industry cadetships, included an employment bond, but also had effectively a higher amount provided for living allowance than the Commonwealth did. Now, avoiding the bond was a marker of prestige, but this came at a cost. Now, some families made sacrifices to make up the difference, as we can see here in a quote from one interviewee who said their parents, said they were definitely not going to give them a bond, and so ensured that they were able to have a living allowance. But others tried to make ends meet. Tried to make up for this through paid employment, especially during the long vacations. And we've got a quote there of one of our interviewees who essentially followed the experience of their sibling to do vacation work. So we've just talked about some of the different features of the Commonwealth and some of the experiences of those that we interviewed through the oral histories. So what might we make of the Commonwealth? Well, we've put up here a quote from Australian economic historian Brian Fitzpatrick in an address to students at the University of Melbourne in 1961. And I might just read it out because I'm conscious people might not be able to see it in the back of the room. Several thousand of you all have fees and some living expenses paid by the Commonwealth Scholarships branch. That in itself involves a vast change in community elite, in its composition and social obligation. But further, I don't know whether you have considered the relative independence it confers on the beneficiaries. Independence of family, of mum and dad, and of rich uncle or cousin. This is perhaps the most significant social aspect of the change. Now, we argue through our study that our study really helps explain what this relative independence was. Our study has shown that for students, the relative independence was that where they were participants in a conversation taking place in homes across the country at the time. With these scholarships, they gained a role in making plans. While they were still constrained, they were often much less so than in earlier schemes and in some ways subsequently. Indeed, our study has shown the extent to which students had to weigh up so many different questions, but in this they had agency in seeking answers. The Commonwealth provided a scaffold that students could climb, but the ascent was different depending on a range of considerations, some of which we've discussed. One thing we might reflect on at this distance is that the full influence of the Commonwealth has been perhaps obscured in part because of the variation in the experience of different students. Nevertheless, it was influential on the outlook of generations of students. So what might we make of the Commonwealth? As one interviewee related to us, and we've put the quote up here, what did the Commonwealth give them? Choice, flexibility, and dignity. Now, just as a final word, we might say that despite the different objectives of those student support policies that have followed the Commonwealth, what we might conclude is that these ideals have been preserved and they really are the enduring legacy of the Commonwealth Scholarship. Thank you.
Above all, we shall need clear minds, honest minds, courageous minds, well-informed minds, in a word, educated minds. For the simple and unpalatable truth is that our democratic system cannot continue if its motive power is to be a mixture of class selfishness, materialism, disregard of minorities, and a somewhat lazy indifference to the future. This powerful statement on the value of education is found in Robert Menzies' 1943 book, The Forgotten People. He recognised that creating self-reliant yet community-minded individuals in the complex post-war world required a renewed emphasis on education. Menzies was able to achieve much in the field of education during his second term as Prime Minister. Some of this achievement, such as the expansion of universities, can be related to his commitment to liberalism and the ideal of the community-minded, free-thinking individual. However, especially in the period between 1961 and 1966, Menzies' educational liberalism in policy and practice shows a number of contradictions. On the one hand, he advocated a form of mass education for enlightened citizenship at primary and secondary level. Yet on the other, Menzies wanted to keep the universities as an elite system, coping with the increased growth in qualified school leavers by creating colleges of advanced education with less status than universities. This paper will explore the continuities and discontinuities of Australian education during Menzies' second term in office, and also the extent to which they reflect Menzies and his government's ideals of liberal education. With the assistance of hard-won scholarships and prizes, Menzies enjoyed the benefits of a private secondary education and a first-class honours degree at Melbourne University. Consequently, as a lawyer and politician, Menzies had great faith in the capacity of Australia's formal education system to produce enterprising and civic-minded individuals. Menzies had three principal ideas relating to liberalism as it applied to education. In the first place, Menzies was a firm believer in mass education as a means of improving the capacity of individuals to prosper in a modern society. Because of the need to maintain standards of living in an era of increasing population growth and technological change, Menzies argued that more and more individuals had to be educated to a high level to contribute effectively as citizens and workers. He also asserted that individuals capable of academic success at the highest level should not be prevented from doing so through lack of funds. Despite regarding higher education as restricted to men and women of obvious talent, Menzies saw the university system as subtly promoting the ideal of mass education, and I quote, "The social, scientific, economic and industrial complexities of Australia today are largely beyond the imagination of 40 years ago. Great skill achieved after higher training is no longer to be admired in a few. We must, on a broad basis, become a more and more educated democracy if we are to raise our spiritual, intellectual and material living standards. Viewed in this way, our universities are to be regarded not as a home of privilege for a few, but as something essential to the lives of millions of people who may never enter their doors." End quote. The second major liberal policy principle in education which Menzies pursued was a firm philosophical commitment to a broad rather than strictly vocational education for Australians, is insisting that the notion that education is a preparation for a living and not for a life is altogether too prevalent. He was personally disturbed by the notion of children and young adults gaining specialist knowledge of a narrow range of subjects without gaining a wider understanding of Western society and its values. And I quote, "A scientist who was unaware of literature and history or of the principles of social responsibility would be dangerous. A humanist who turned his back on the discoveries in natural science, who did not know something of their impact upon life and living, would be condemning himself to a socially fruitless life." End quote. Menzies' third and final conception of the role of liberalism in education was his belief that the first and foremost purpose of formal education was to provide the individual with a broad ethical framework and a sense of proportion and balance. In Menzies' worldview, the development of educational and vocational knowledge could not be separated from the development of character. And I quote, "The first function of education is to produce a good man and a good citizen. Its second function is to produce a good carpenter or a good lawyer, and the good carpenter and good lawyer will all be the better at their respective crafts if they have become aware of the problems of the world and have developed that comparative sense that produces detachment of judgment and tend always to moderate passion and prejudice." End quote. So much for the rhetoric. So what of the reality? To what extent did Menzies' fine-sounding words translate into policy and action during the 1950s and 60s? Sir Robert Menzies' greatest contribution to education was in the tertiary sector. He saw universities as the training ground for Australia's future leaders, professionals, and public servants. He also believed that the discipline of research at the university level taught the students values which assisted with long-term professional decision-making, such as patience, objectivity, balance, and detachment. Through training the elite individual in pure as opposed to just practical learning, Menzies argued that the universities were fighting a rearguard action against the growing materialism of Western society. And I quote, "Are the universities mere technical schools, or have they as one of their functions the preservation of pure learning, bringing in its train not merely riches for the imagination, but a comparative sense for the mind, and leading to what we need so badly, the recognition of values which are other than pecuniary?" Menzies' post-war university reforms built upon the work begun by the Curtin and Chifley Labor governments during the 1940s. Labor's major education initiatives included the establishment of the Australian National University and the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, which provided funds for the training of ex-servicemen and women. Before World War II, the Commonwealth spent very little on education, which was constitutionally a state concern. By 1942, however, the states agreed to give up the right to collect income tax, giving the Commonwealth a monopoly on annual income tax collection. This was a temporary war measure which became permanent by default. The new tax arrangements emboldened the Commonwealth to incrementally play a larger national role in education, especially within the tertiary sector. Largely because of the imminent conclusion of the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme and the increased demands for a university education, Menzies in 1951 introduced a Commonwealth University Scholarship Scheme, as well as assistance to the states for universities. Menzies' legislation conformed to his liberal ideals. The Prime Minister did not attempt to use the Commonwealth's increased powers to force universities to adopt particular principles or emphases. Prior to the 1951 legislation, Menzies told representatives of the Vice-Chancellor's Committee that the British tradition of autonomy in the universities must be preserved at all costs. Freedom to expend their funds as they saw fit should be at the absolute discretion of the governing bodies, end quote. However, the Commonwealth's new subsidies did little to substantially ease the university's infrastructure problems, such as overcrowded lecture halls and limited capacity for research. Until 1956, Menzies' response to lobbying by universities and the states for more Commonwealth tertiary funds was muted. He may, of course, have been preoccupied with other government and political priorities. He may also have been ambivalent about increasing the Commonwealth's financial stake in the university sector. Whatever the case, by the late 1950s, the Menzies government had adopted a more generous attitude towards funding higher education, accepting recommendations from a specially commissioned report on Australian universities by Sir Keith Murray. In 1957, Menzies committed the Commonwealth to playing a large role in expanding the infrastructure, facilities and research of universities, including the provision for the first time of postgraduate scholarships. The Liberal government's increased funding enabled the number of students enrolled at Australian universities to rise from 53,338 to some 100,000 between 1960 and 1968. There can be little doubt that Menzies' liberal ideals influenced his ultimate generosity towards the university sector. As Sir Keith Murray later remembered, "I shall never forget Menzies' parting words. I have been almost 30 years in Australian politics. I have not found them very rewarding, but if I leave the Australian universities in a healthy state, it will all have been worthwhile." It was said with such a note of sincerity that I was convinced of his deep-seated devotion to the university's welfare and to scholarship in general. Still, despite his attachment to the ideal of the university as an agent of free thinking and civilisation, Menzies retained a belief that universities were for the elite, not financial elites, but academic elites who would make a contribution to public life. Menzies' last major educational decision was to authorise the creation of colleges of advanced education to absorb many of the growing number of school leavers with raised expectations of receiving a tertiary education. The colleges were designed to be more vocationally orientated than their university counterparts and to cost less money because they did not engage in research. The colleges of advanced education were a compromise between the desire to permit all qualified students to gain access to tertiary education and the desire to retain universities as special institutions shaping the best minds. Speaking at Melbourne University, Menzies said he did not wish to see the standards of our universities lowered or bodies called universities which were not in fact universities. This had nothing to do with intellectual snobbery, but flowed from the university's need to preserve the highest intellectual standards. These standards should not be swept away by a flood of numbers, but should rise and continue to rise all the time, end quote. In contrast to his generosity regarding universities, Menzies' support for primary and secondary schools was initially limited. For their part, the states did not immediately sense any urgency to increase education funding. School leavers exiting school at 14, 15 and 16 were easily absorbed into jobs such as manufacturing during the early post-war period. However, as the 1950s progressed, more and more students remained longer at school as employers began to demand greater qualifications of many of their workers. Moreover, because of post-war migration and a rising birth rate, the school-age population in Australia rose from 1.2 million in 1948 to 2.31 million in 1963. The call naturally grew during this period for Commonwealth money to be directly spent on ensuring that schools received adequate resources in a time of booming enrolments. Once back in power from 1949 onwards, however, the Menzies government tended to argue that education was, under the Constitution, a state matter. This reflected the Liberal Party's commitment to anti-centralisation and an understandable reluctance to increase Commonwealth expenditure. Nevertheless, Menzies' period in office saw the Commonwealth decisively intervene in school-based education for the first time. The Menzies government's contribution to school funding was modest in the 1950s. In 1952, the Menzies government made tuition fees of up to £60 tax deductible. Then in 1954, tax deductions were permitted for donations to school projects, school building projects. Finally, Menzies in 1956 committed the Commonwealth to repaying interests on the capital building loans of Canberra's independent schools. Menzies' support for the private schools can be interpreted as an expression of Menzian liberalism. He believed that church schools were a means of producing self-reliant, enterprising individuals with an appreciation of their responsibilities towards others. In Menzies' view, Christianity and education were inextricably linked. Society doesn't want clever pagans, he declared in 1960. It needs educated Christian gentlemen. This seems to contradict Menzies' own liberal philosophy, which stressed the freedom of the individual, free thinking and free choice. His support for private Christian schools nevertheless reflected his simplistic solution to the problem of ensuring that the educated individual produces a positive rather than negative contribution to social cohesion. Facing calls from state governments in the early 60s to invest substantial Commonwealth money in the state's primary and secondary schools, Menzies was slow to act. However, as part of his 1963 election policy, Menzies introduced a large-scale scholarship scheme for secondary and technical school students, committed £5 million per year to improve science facilities at secondary level, and provided £5 million per annum for infrastructure costs at technical schools. In this way, Menzies was responding to pressure from the states and the media for the Commonwealth to deal with the shortage of teachers and facilities at a time when the school population was rapidly expanding. The Prime Minister's unprecedented Commonwealth support for secondary and technical education also took the political shine out of Labor leader Arthur Calwell's attempt to capitalise on this issue during the lead-up to the 1963 election. Indeed, Calwell might have been forgiven for accusing his political rival of stealing ALP policies, which in the early 60s had also included a generous commitment to secondary and technical school scholarships. It's worth noting that for all Menzies' stress on the benefits of a broad-based liberal education, the Commonwealth's aid to secondary schools in the mid-60s emphasised the sciences, but not the humanities. This was a reflection of the technical age that was emerging, in which unprecedented investment in science was leading to advances in agriculture, manufacturing and other drivers of prosperity. Still, in 1965, Menzies took care to frame his government's investment in secondary school science infrastructure as symbolic of educational liberalism, and I quote, "I went out to Bathurst the other day to open a science block at a school. These boys will be able to equip themselves to be pioneers of a new growth of knowledge." Bathurst, after all, was the new frontier itself, opened up by Blaxland and Wentworth. And I said to these boys, just as these great men had sought out new frontiers and discovered them, so they themselves would be the pioneers. We can all be pioneers. And the more talented we are, the more we can pioneer great movements, great things, great body of knowledge. End quote. Menzies' liberalism shows a number of contradictions. On the one hand, he advocated a form of mass education for enlightened citizenship at primary and secondary level. Yet on the other, Menzies wanted to keep the universities as an elite system, coping with the increased growth in qualified school leavers by creating colleges of advanced education with less status than universities. Menzies strongly advocated the right of the individual to act freely and to build their own destiny, yet rewarded the individual who sent their child to a private school with tax deductions. Some choices were better than others. On the whole, though, Menzies' educational achievements are worth remembering and celebrating. As a political actor, Menzies often played a constitutional purist, reluctant to move into state matters such as education, but partly through political pressure and his own inclination, his role shifted towards a more nationally minded, if still financially cautious, sponsor of education reforms, which decisively changed public attitudes towards the funding of schools and tertiary education, paving the way for greater national investment in education during the Whitlam era and beyond. As John Gorton told his colleagues in 1966, regardless of constitutional niceties, the public want and expect a greater Commonwealth involvement in education. Finally, it's what Menzies didn't do as much as what he did that gave his liberal vision of education its strength of character. Menzies and his government did not seek to interfere with the administration and priorities of educational institutions. However, his funding of scholarships and support for infrastructure facilitated the educational achievements of young people. The growth of the universities in particular encouraged students from a diverse range of backgrounds, including regional and rural communities, to prosper and to be enriched by their learning of science, the arts, humanities, and other subjects that interested them as individuals. Indeed, Menzies was proud to say that whenever I go around Australia and look at a university and see the great buildings rising to the sky, I take some pleasure in the fact that it is our government and our party that has produced these phenomenal results. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.